Greetings, humanity. Today is Friday, February 13th, 2026. Let's grok the news. I'm Robert Gardner, using GROK each weekday to help me search out and to summarize the biggest headlines in the news today. You also get the unparalleled benefit of this observer's opinions. We review a roundup of the most critical reports in the world from Bangladesh, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., Tokyo, Nairobi, and the rest of the world. But first, a deep dive into today's top story right after this. M.S. Gardner, my beautiful, brilliant wife, is author of last year's Moon Meridian Prize winner from April Gloaming Publishing. Wolfsbane, a dark, serious, modern take on an old fairy tale. You've never heard Little Red Riding Hood told like this. It's a page-turning Southern Gothic story for adults that you can't put down. It might not put you down for a while either. Wolfsbane, available now at thecuriousauthor.com. All one word, thecuriousauthor.com. Also available on Amazon. And now let's grok the most important news in the world today, starting with our lead story, Dateline.com, Bangladesh. In a seismic shift following the 2024 Gen Z-led uprising that toppled longtime Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or the BNP, led by Tarique Rahman, has won a commanding landslide victory in the country's first competitive parliamentary election in over a decade. Early counts show the BNP securing more than two-thirds of the seats, over 212 out of 300, positioning Rahman as the likely next prime minister. The vote, hailed by many as a second liberation, drew massive turnout, with voters overjoyed after years of authoritarian rule and deadly protests. The election marks a generational handover driven by youth frustration over corruption, economic hardship, and repression under the previous Awami League government. International observers noted improved fairness compared to past polls, though isolated violence and allegations of irregularities persisted in some areas. The decisive result signals a major realignment in South Asian politics, with implications for regional stability, economic ties with India and China, and Bangladesh's democratic trajectory. Rahman, who returned from exile, has pledged reforms, anti-corruption measures, and economic revival. Well, good luck to them. And now, we grok the headlines from around the globe. Dateline, Washington, D.C. The Trump administration has revoked the Obama-era EPA endangerment finding on greenhouse gases, stripping the legal foundation for federal regulations on carbon emissions from vehicles, power plants, and industry. Officials call it the largest deregulatory move yet, aimed at slashing costs and boosting energy production. The usual critics warn that it accelerates climate risks and undermines global commitments. Dateline Tehran. Satellite imagery reveals Iran is rapidly fortifying its underground nuclear complex near Natanz, highlighting concerns amid ongoing U.S. and Israel threats and nuclear negotiations under the Trump administration. Dateline, the Persian Gulf. The U.S. has ordered the USS Gerald R Ford carrier strike group, the world's largest warship, to redeploy from the Caribbean to the Middle East, joining the USS Abraham Lincoln amid escalating Iran nuclear tensions and the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. Unspoken in all of this is the plight of the Iranian people, dead in the tens of thousands, protesting while waiting for the help promised by the American president. Dateline Minneapolis. The Trump administration has ended its extended immigration enforcement surge in Minneapolis, with Border Czar Tom Homan confirming the drawdown after months of operations, a couple of local deaths, and heated political clashes. The move follows the capitulation of Minnesota and Minneapolis politicians who stood in the way of federal enforcement of immigration laws in one of the most corrupt states in the Union. By the way, this observer should mention that the deaths, although of course they happened locally, every death happens locally, these were not locals. These were people who came to Minneapolis for the purpose of joining in the permanent protests in the insurrection ongoing there. Dateline, Washington, D.C., Senator Josh Hawley has called for the indictment of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison over alleged ties to a Somali fraud network, escalating partisan tensions. Tensions, escalation. That's all we hear these days in the news. Hawley played the tape of the collusion in Congress between the Attorney General and the Somali fraudsters. If there was ever a corrupt official caught more red-handed, this observer is unaware. But stand by. There's more on the Minnesota mutiny later in this broadcast. Dateline, Munich. Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned European leaders of a new geopolitical era ahead of his major speech at the Munich Security Conference, underscoring deepening transatlantic strains over trade, defense, and global priorities. In other words, the USA is no longer going to be the lackey and muscle behind Europe's global priorities. Dateline, Pretoria, South Africa. South Africa has deployed army troops nationwide to confront surging violent crime gangs, marking a major military escalation in response to public safety demands and pressure from organized crime. Well, all is not bad news down in Africa. Stand by for a story on that. Dateline, Tokyo. Japan has seized a Chinese fishing vessel in disputed East China Sea waters, the first such action since 2022. Escalating maritime tensions. There we go again with that word. Tensions between Beijing and Tokyo. A Chinese fishing vessel. Oh, it's always a Chinese fishing vessel or a narco-terrorist fishing vessel. You know, just because it's on the water, that doesn't make it a fishing vessel. Dateline, Tumbler Ridge. A rare mass shooting has shaken the small Canadian town of Tumbler Ridge, leaving that tight-knit community in mourning as authorities release details, drop by drop, on the victims and the ongoing investigation. Authorities finally revealed that yet another drug-crazed transsexual young man was at the heart of the tragedy. Dateline, Washington, D.C. President Trump has pardoned 5 former NFL players convicted of offenses including perjury and drug trafficking, drawing a fresh controversy over the use of executive clemency. Never mind thousands upon thousands who received the clemency of the Biden auto pen. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Only one House Democrat voted in favor of a bill requiring voter ID and proof of citizenship for U.S. elections. You know, as civilized nations do. This underscored the deep partisan divide on voting integrity measures. Now the SAFE Act goes to the Senate, where a handful of Republicans are standing against election reform and siding with Democrats against ending the out-of-date filibuster rule so that there can be a clean vote. This observer wonders why these liberal Republican fossils still side against their own voters and with an establishment that will hardly last longer than themselves. I mean, they're old. Dateline Nairobi and Mogadishu. Here's that good news from Africa. Kenya has reopened its border with Somalia after nearly 15 years of closure, signaling a significant diplomatic and security thaw in the Horn of Africa. Dateline Sydney, Australia. Oh, by the way, Somalia recently instated voter ID. Dateline Sydney, Australia. Australia's police watchdog is investigating Sydney officers following violent clashes during protests against Israeli President Herzog's visit, raising questions about crowd control and free expression down under. This observer would like to report that Australians are investigating the Islamic extremism and terrorism and migration that allowed the Bondi Beach massacre to happen. Instead, the politicians there are squalling for more gun control and less free speech. Dateline Washington, D.C. Senator Tim Sheehy has sharply criticized U.S. wildfire response systems as woefully inadequate, calling for urgent reforms in the wake of recent devastating blazes. As this observer and others have pointed out, we need to ignore those that Rush Limbaugh once called environmentalist wackos and start managing the forests as we used to. Shoot, even as the so-called American Indian used to, you stop letting them build up into gigantic bonfires. You groom the woods rather than waiting for the next dry season, high winds, and the next arsonists. And fill up your reservoirs, for goodness sake. Dateline Los Angeles. A Los Angeles neighborhood is pushing for installation of air raid sirens, warning sirens, to alert residents of nearby immigration control and enforcement activity amid widespread so-called community fears, whipped up by those who profit from fear. This observer thinks that insurrection should be dealt with as insurrection, and these politicians need to be shown that, and their voters. And in our final insurrection story today, Minneapolis is the dateline. The mayor there, Jacob Frey, has announced a lawsuit against the Trump administration, accusing it of stripping the constitutional rights of who? Residents? They're not citizens. They don't have, well, they have human rights, but they don't have rights under the U.S. Constitution. That's for U.S. citizens. Oh, and Frey has denied that he made any deal. Speaking of insurrection, it is long past time, in this observer's opinion, for Mayor Frey and Governor Walz and other Democrat insurrectionists, that's what they are, it's time for them to be held without bail in a brig somewhere, awaiting trial by military tribunal. You heard me, and I thank you for listening. Please join me Monday to once again GROK the News. I'm Robert Gardner. Godspeed and God bless.